Today's speaker is Maryland Attorney General Doug Gansler, a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School. Prior to becoming Attorney General and before becoming the state's attorney, Mr. Gansler had served as Assistant United States Attorney, where he personally prosecuted over 1,000 cases. His most notable case was the successful prosecution of a drunk driving diplomat who killed a 16-year-old Maryland girl near DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. He has served as state's attorney for Montgomery County from 1999 to 2007, and in 2006 was elected Attorney General for the state of Maryland. As we've seen recently, the role of the state's attorney is critical, and the role of the state's attorney general is extremely critical in law enforcement community throughout our society and in the state of Maryland. It is now my pleasure to welcome Maryland State Attorney General Doug Gansler to the CCBC.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I don't know if this is working or not, but in any event, we are here to talk about the sniper case, and I'm actually going to just give a little bit of an overview and then turn it over to the Chief Deputy Attorney General of Maryland, Kay Winfree, who actually was the lawyer who tried the case and knows more about the sniper situation than anybody, well, other than the two guys that did it in the country. What happened was, I was the state's attorney, which for those of you, I guess you're all from here in Maryland, that's like the DA, and we do all the criminal cases. So what happened in Montgomery County, unlike Baltimore, we have almost 1 million people, but we have very, very few murders. So we have between 10 and 20 murders a year. And what we did as a matter of policy was anytime there was a homicide, we would send out two prosecutors, one or two prosecutors to that particular scene. So on the night of the first night, there was a shooting through and through in a parking lot outside of, was it Michael's? Shoppers Warehouse, and somebody was killed. So we just sent the next person up on the list to go out there and look at the murder and see what we could learn and get evidence there and start working right from the very beginning with the police department in developing what would ultimately, hopefully, be a prosecution. They didn't figure out who did it, obviously. The next morning, during an hour and 12-minute period, there were 3 murders in one area. The area is called Aspen Hill. It's kind of like between Wheaton and Rockville in Montgomery County. And then we knew something was up. And they were very similar. They were sniper-type shooting. They were not closed-up shootings. They were shootings from afar. So at that time, we started working with the police, trying to figure out what we could do here, set up a command center. Kay Winfree and my other deputy went out there, and one of them was at the command center. The other one went to the scenes. There were many more people murdered. During that 22-day period, there were ultimately 10 people killed in our area. These people, the 2 men that were responsible, John Muhammad and Lee Boy Malvo, started actually in Tacoma, Washington, on a killing spree across the United States. They started up there, they went south, killed someone in Arizona, came across the south part of the country, Alabama, Louisiana, up through Georgia. They were killing people all along the way, and they got to Maryland. Obviously, none of this was known at the time. So what they did, what we did was we called everybody together in our office and said, is anyone aware of any prosecutions or cases in the last couple of days where somebody lost their wife, lost their job, was in nasty divorce, or, threatened somebody? Can anyone think of who this might be? There were no answers to that question. We obviously looked at a few people. We set up during the next 22 days, and by the way, for a serial killer, some of you are probably too young to remember most of this, but for a serial killer, to bring them in within 22 days is actually quite good. In a quite short period of time, because it usually takes a lot longer, particularly where there was seemingly no motive other than killing human beings, which is what this was. So you could kind of look and see what the motives might be, and you would never come up with one. Usually there's a motive and an opportunity in every crime. This crime was all about opportunity. So we had about 1,200 people on what was called the Joint Sniper Task Force, law enforcement officers, federal, local, state. I ran the legal part of it, along with my 2 deputies. We kind of someone was there at all times. We had an office. One of the sort of side pieces of this is we learned a lot about some of the nuts that lived in that area in Montgomery County. I remember we at one point there was a suspect that they thought had done it. They went to his office and they had a map with a pin where all the shootings were. Of course, that wasn't the person. There was another guy who had just come back after the shooting. I think he was stopped. He was a dentist or something in Upper Marlboro, and they stopped him and they asked him to look at his car and, what kind of gun do you have in there? It was a .322, which was the kind of gun that was being used for the shootings. He also had some information regarding all these shootings, and he wouldn't let the police look at the gun. They had to get a warrant to get the gun. Turned out he wasn't the person. There was another guy whose wife called, said, I think my husband might have been the person. They went to the house. He had like an arsenal of guns. When, he was sort of fit the profile. He wasn't the person. And so there was a number of sort of false leads throughout the thing. Technology was brought to bear that really hadn't been used very much before. For example, you have cell phones and they go out. Sometimes there's roaming, or you lose the connection. Well, it turns out that wherever you are, and I have my cell phone on right now, there's a tower nearby that has my cell phone number listed on that tower. So you can get the records, and they kind of go over themselves every 24 hours. So one of the things that they thought to do was to freeze the towers, the records on each of the towers near where the shootings were, and see if they can match the records. Ultimately, the guys ended up turning themselves in, basically. Malvo made a phone call, said if you looked into this shooting down, it was in Montgomery, Alabama, no. And then they did, and they kind of figured out who it was. They got the car. They put the car, the make and license of the car on the television screen, and they were brought in sleeping in Frederick County. We were there. There were 3 shootings ultimately in Virginia, 1 in D.C. and the 6 in Montgomery County. There was a couple other killings. There were a couple other shootings, one in Prince George's County of a young boy who's now actually in college, or maybe he was out by now. And then we brought him in. They came into an undisclosed location. I don't know if you remember, the media attention on this was unbelievable. It was, O.J. Simpson trial. The O.J. Simpson trial was sort of the beginning of cable television, and all in terms of cable television and crime. And they would be on 24 hours a day talking about the different that trial, and kind of from all different angles. Well, this wasn't that far after that, and they were on. Everybody who'd ever been a law enforcement officer or a prosecutor was on TV talking about this case. You'd come home from kind of 12, 14, 16, 18 hours of working on this case, and I would just be slouched on my couch listening to these people talk about who might have done it. They were looking for a white, militant guy who probably, former military officer, former military person who probably lived in the Aspen Hill area. Well, it turned out not to be that person. And then somebody said they thought they saw a white van leaving from one of the crime scenes, so every white van in the area was pulled over all day long. And obviously that was not correct either. So they were brought in. There was a sort of a media circus. They were brought into a juvenile facility where no one thought they would be in Montgomery County, both of them. At that time, Malvo was truly, and I'm not one of these people that believes, the cat made me do it. I'm pretty suspicious of that kind of thing. But at that time, Malvo really was under the auspices and sort of control of Muhammad. He had a long personal life of sort of neglect, and he really latched on to Muhammad. They were brought in. Then at that time, we had a very unethical United States attorney at the time here in Maryland who tried to basically lied his way to try and get these guys taken into federal custody because he wanted to prosecute them for his own satisfaction. Unfortunately, for him, there was no federal crimes involved in this case. But while he brought them into the federal system, they were no longer in the state system. So John Ashcroft, who was the United States Attorney, the Attorney General of the United States at the time, really had it in his control the case for 2 weeks as to where should this case be prosecuted. And he was very much in favor of the death penalty for both of these people. Remember, Malvo was a juvenile at the time. So they made the determination to send the case to Virginia to prosecute. They killed 3 people in Virginia, 1 in 3 different jurisdictions, so it would be for 1 murder. They ended up sending Muhammad to 1 jurisdiction and Malvo to another jurisdiction in Virginia because they actually do carry out the death penalty, and the end of the story is that Muhammad does get executed. So as one Virginia prosecutor said to me during the 2-week time period, and I actually couldn't believe I was in the 21st century, send them down here, we'll have them fried in 5, is what they said. There hadn't been no trial yet. They were sent down there. They lost the case on Malvo in terms of capital punishment anyway. Between that time and within the next couple of years, the Supreme Court said that you could not execute juveniles in the United States. So it really was of no moment. They were though convicted. Muhammad got the death penalty in Virginia. There were some appellate issues at the time that arose, and our victims in Montgomery County had not had their day in court. No one was talking about their loved ones who had been killed, and no one really knew why, how, or how this occurred. So we ended up prosecuting them in Montgomery County. By that time, Malvo was a very different person. And every time that they're going to take a human being and put them in a cage for the rest of their life, it's tragic. It's tragic for what they did, but it's actually tragic of the loss of life. And Malvo's case was a little different than some. Some guys, some people, and I've been in homicide at the U.S. Attorney's Office for 3.5 years, and you see a lot of people that are unlikely ever to be productive members of society. Malvo was a little different. In fact, the very first time he came into our office to talk to us, he reached out to us at this point. We had a conversation about Ayn Rand, the Ayn Rand book, A Fountainhead, he'd been reading while in jail, and the difference between Peter Keating and Howard Roark. And clearly this young man was very, very intelligent. At the same time, he was a cold-blooded killer who could look through a scope and see somebody as close as this and pull the trigger, a perfect stranger, for no reason. But he was a very articulate, bright young man who one would think would have a very good future. We spent an enormous amount of time with him. I'm going to let Kay talk about that. And ultimately, there was a trial. It cost about a little over $1,000 to do, because we already had all the evidence. We already had, we'd already done it all. So it was a matter of just trying the case. It was about 3 weeks. It was, as one judge said about Miss Winfree, she can't say as I can, it was the perfect trial. And we were able to convict them both for the 6 counts of murder, and got life without the possibility of parole for both of them. And then we had to send them back to Virginia. Now, at one point, Malvo, who now is very much, very cooperative, and there's a lot of discussion, and she could talk about this, about whether you put him on the stand, whether we believed him or not, because we couldn't sponsor his testimony. We didn't need his testimony, because there's just a mountain of evidence, obviously, of Muhammad doing this against Muhammad. But we thought it was important for the families to be in court, to understand, to hear how and why this happened from start to finish, and be able to answer any questions that they might have. Malvo ultimately wanted to tell us all about all the murders, and was willing to do that with all the families coming from around the country to a courtroom. We wanted to do that. All he wanted from it was getting out of this particular jail in Virginia and be moved to another jail. We wanted to put him in a federal facility, but the Virginia prosecutors said we're not going to do that, because he shouldn't get anything. Obviously, he wasn't going to get anything. He was going to be in a cell for the rest of his life, but those families would have had their day in court, so it was unfortunate that that did not happen. Muhammad ended up going through the appellate process and was executed in Virginia a few months ago. And I think depending on what you feel about the death penalty or not, if you're for it or against it, we do have it. He's the guy that should get it, but he didn't get it in Maryland. He got it in Virginia. With that, I'm going to just pass the mic over to Kay Winfree, let her talk a little bit about her reflections, and either of us be happy to take any questions or thoughts or comments on it when she finishes.
Well, he didn't really leave too much for me to say, but I wanted to talk a little bit about our role in the prosecutions in Maryland. As the Attorney General mentioned, when they were finished with the judicial system in Virginia, the governor of Virginia called the governor of Maryland, who 2002, I think it was Governor Ehrlich, wasn't it, and asked if we still wanted to prosecute them, and we did. We had 6 murders in Montgomery County and a couple of other shootings, and it was important to us that the survivors of the families would have their day in court. So they were brought back to Maryland, to Montgomery County in 2005, and we knew from his lawyers that Malvo was probably going to plead guilty. We didn't have any kind of agreement with him yet. And I was sitting at my desk one day in March of 2006. Muhammad's trial was going to be in May. We decided to do him first, obviously, because he was the worst of the two. And I received a letter from the jail, and it was from Lee Boyd Malvo. And he addressed me personally and said, "I will testify. I want to tell my story. Call my lawyer." Well, you know, it's sort of in a little bit of a sense, a prosecutor's dream, but as the Attorney General said, we didn't really need him. And in a lot of homicide cases, you don't want to mess your case up with a cooperating defendant when you don't really know whether they're going to be truthful. When he went to Virginia, Lee Malvo was interviewed extensively by local law enforcement, and at that time, he was still under the influence of Muhammad. And he took credit or blame, whichever way you want to look at it, for all of the shootings. He said he had done all the fatal shootings. It was all on him. And as he was awaiting trial, his lawyers got him a social worker who worked with him and psychiatrists, and ultimately he backed away from that story and began to tell a different version of it. So we were confronted with an initial version where he said, "I did them all," and then a second version where he said he did some of them and Muhammad did some of them. So, you know, that again presents a dilemma. How do you know which one is true? We brought him in. He met with the Attorney General. We talked about ground rules. We asked him, "Why is it you want to testify? What is in it for you?" And he said that he knew he couldn't bring these people back. He knew no matter how remorseful he was or whatever he did, it wasn't going to change anything. But there were two things he wanted. He wanted the opportunity to confront Muhammad, and he wanted the opportunity to try to explain from their perspective, from what he knew, what had happened so that the families could understand. And he knew that wasn't going to bring them any comfort. He knew it wasn't going to bring them any closure. He just believed that it might help them understand, and it was just something he felt the obligation to do. And we said to him that day, and this was probably back in March of 2006, you know, we held all the cards, we didn't need him, and I told him, looked him in the face and said, "You will not testify if I don't believe you." And so we spent many, many hours. We met with him several times before the trial started, and then every weekend, once the trial was underway, we met with them virtually all day, Saturday and Sunday, going over all of the crimes that they had done and trying to understand it. We had law enforcement there with us who had intimate knowledge of the facts of the investigation. And we slowly began to believe that he was telling us the truth. As the Attorney General said, he's very bright, he's very articulate, he's an artist, and he has sort of an artist's photographic memory for detail and could actually not only talk about it but draw the scenes of things that he had seen. And what he told us was a story about really a perfect storm of two individuals who came together at a bad time. He, as a 15-year-old youth who had no father figure in his life, and Muhammad, who was looking for someone to be a killing machine. And that's what he turned Lee Malvo into. We started the trial in May of 2006. In my opening statement, I didn't even mention that Lee Boyd Malvo was a potential witness. I didn't want to make a promise. We hadn't decided what we were going to do. We didn't decide until the weekend. We'd finished all the witnesses except for him on a Friday. We had court on Monday. We spent the final weekend with him at the jail in Clarksburg in Montgomery County. And I remember vividly looking at him across the table and thinking, you know, and I told him, I believe you at this point, but I have to know that you're not going to spin me, that you're not going to get on the stand. And, you know, who knew what his motivation was? And he shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said, "I promise you, I've told you the truth, and I'm going to tell the truth at the trial." And he took the stand, and he did something that I think must have been incredibly difficult for him to do. Obviously, his direct examination when I was asking him questions was difficult because he was publicly talking for the first time about really horrible acts, and I believe that he was remorseful for those. But the real challenge for him came on cross-examination. Muhammad represented himself. He had two standby lawyers, but he examined all of the witnesses. And it was a really fascinating exchange when he started his cross-examination, trying to exert that control over Lee Malvo. And, you know, he started by saying, "The last time we played basketball, who won?" You did. The last time we ran a mile, who won? You did. Reminding him that I'm physically superior. I was the one who had the control. And there was a little bit of a period of time when it looked like Lee was going to be kind of sucked into that. And then he became very, very strong, and there was a point at which Muhammad was asking him, didn't I bring you into my home? Didn't I bring you into my family? Didn't I treat you just like you were one of my children? And Malvo said yes or no, and he kept yes and no, and he kept trying to say it's not a yes and no question, and he said yes it is. And he said, well, how did I treat you any differently? And he said, I was the only child that you made into a killing machine. You didn't take your other family members and turn them into a monster. You made me a monster. That's what you did to me. And it was, I'm getting sort of goosebumps just telling you about it. It was really a chilling moment. So he told us about all of the crimes that we knew about in Montgomery County. He talked, as the Attorney General told you, during the debriefing. He told us about lots and lots of other crimes. And he wanted nothing more, really, than to get out of this one prison. He would have brought closure to all of the cases across the country that he and Muhammad had been responsible for, but for the unwillingness of the prosecutors in Virginia to go along with this. So he is now in prison in Virginia. After the Muhammad trial, he pled guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder and got 6 consecutive life without parole sentences, as did Muhammad. And Muhammad was sent back 2 days after his trial. I remember vividly the judge looked at him and looked at the sheriffs and said, get this man out of our county, take him back to Virginia. We don't want anything more to do with him. He was executed in Virginia in November of 2009, so just about 11 months ago. Lee Malvo is still locked up. You might have seen William Shatner has this crazy new show called Aftermath, and he was interviewed on Aftermath about 2 months ago and claims not only about all the crimes that we knew, but probably about 24 more. I think at this point he's stretching credibility. I don't really think there's anything to support that, but maybe it gets boring when you're locked up at the age of 16 or 18, however old he was when he was locked up for life. So I guess that's really all I wanted to tell you about the trial. And I'm sure you have some questions for the Attorney General.
I have a question. What is the background of Muhammad? Like, where he comes from? I just never heard about it.
The question was, what was Muhammad's background, where he comes from? Truthfully, I don't remember where he grew up, but he was an Army Ranger, I believe. He was in the military. He he fought in Desert Storm. He had some difficulties with some of his supervisors there. He turned to, he became a Muslim in the Army and developed a real hatred for authority, a real hatred for white people that he believed were, in his view, he was very, very angry that his children had been taken away from him. He talked about wanting to make people pay attention, and he wanted to terrorize people. I think he was very angry about his children being taken away. I don't know a lot about his family background. He was married before. He's been married twice. He had 1 son from an early marriage, and then 3 children from his current wife, who took the children away from him.
Thank you.
Yes.
Why was the Virginia prosecutor so insistent on not letting him be transferred?
The question was, why was the Virginia prosecutor so insistent on him staying in? I can only, guess that the reason that the prosecutor, they didn't believe him. You have to remember that when he came to Virginia, he took full credit or blame for all of the. You want this?
No.
For all of the crimes, and they were very unhappy that when he was sent to Maryland, that he was telling a different story. I think there was some concern that they thought it was going to undermine their Virginia prosecution somehow, and they just you know, they were very hard-nosed about it and just didn't think that this, I think, what did he call it? These are heinous crimes had been committed by this young man, and that he wasn't entitled to any concessions. And it just was sort of a no-brainer to us that, you know, we could put him. Why wouldn't Virginia want to transfer him to a federal institution and let the feds pay for, you know, the lifetime of this prisoner? But they weren't willing to do it.
Can we share the mic, because that one went dead on me?
What?
That one went dead? Yeah, that one went dead on me.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. As far as the motive of Muhammad, wasn't his motive for killing all those people, he eventually wanted to go kill his wife and make it look like, you know, he didn't want to be found guilty to have done that, so he was going around the country killing all these people. What is your process for figuring out what somebody's motive is like that?
Well, the question wasn't Muhammad's ultimate motive that he wanted to that he was killing all these people as sort of a cover for when he would go and kill his wife. And then the second part of the question was, what is our process for determining motive? I'm going to start with the second part of that, though it's important to understand, and it's really helpful if you can understand and present evidence of motive to a jury. It's not a legal requirement. So if we're able to find out motive, obviously we want to be able to present that. At the time that they were arrested, we had no idea what the motive was. And I know that his wife, Mildred, his ex-wife, Mildred Muhammad, that's what she believes, that she believes his ultimate motive was always to come and kill her. There isn't any evidence of that. Whatever was in his mind, you know, Muhammad had denied all responsibility, you know, throughout his trials. He wasn't responsible for any of this. He never told Lee Malvo that that was his motive. They did, I won't say, sort of stalk her. There was a period of time when they located where she was in, I think she was in Prince George's County. She was in Prince George's County, and Malvo followed her a little bit, knocked on her door one day. They had an opportunity to kill her, and they did, and they'd already, you know, committed some murders by that point in time. So she may be right, but there's, other than her belief, there isn't any evidence of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably preposterous to think that that was actually the motive. But what was more likely to be the motive was that, you know, remember 9/11 was a year earlier. And I think really what they were trying to do, which what they were successful in doing, was to create a state of terror in this area. And then what happens is it feeds upon itself. As they were more and more successful and more people became hysterical. I mean, if those of us who were around remember, you know, people were zigzagging to the store and ducking when they were filling their gas tanks and stuff, when the reality was you were far more likely to get killed by a drunk driver still on your way to work. But the hysteria that surrounded this was huge, and I think that that's what they wanted, and they enjoyed it. And then they started making these calls, and they started leaving clues at some of their crimes, and ultimately were found. But I think the motive was nothing more, nothing less than killing humans as prey and creating a terrorist state. Yeah.
How much was the investigation influenced or resources wasted by the media obsession with the white van, the whole middle-aged white army guy?
How much were the resources that were wasted on that?
How much was the investigation itself influenced by that?
Well, I think that the idea was people thought it might, I mean, law enforcement was not sort of completely focused on that. They were looking at all kinds of other things. I mentioned the car that it stopped at Fort Washington, for example. You know, it was a Cadillac. It was not a white van. You know, it's interesting sort of from a psychological point of view. People want to be helpful in times of crisis, and so people were calling all over about the white van. Everyone thought, you know, they were trying to be helpful. So in that sense, it detracted. Maybe people missed things. So maybe people were looking for a white van at subsequent shootings when they could have been looking for this blue killing machine, you know, with the hole in the back where the Malvo, just in case you don't remember, one of them would sit in the back. Usually Malvo would sit in the back and look through this peephole, and the gun was sticking out of where the gas tank might have been, and the other one was driving. And so people might have missed that. I mean, it wasn't a resource issue, but it was deflection of attention, if nothing less. Yes?
Lessons learned?
Well, I think there were a lot of lessons learned. I mean, One was that there was no copycat. I mean, the biggest issue people thought was at the time was there's going to be copycat people. There's going to be people around the country that are going to go doing this. But the nice thing is that there are very few people that are insidious and sick enough that would want to just look through a scope and start shooting perfect strangers and killing them. The other thing was to watch law enforcement work together. I mean, they are very turf-oriented, and there were some turf fights in this, but really, for the most part, they were all wearing the same uniform and trying to bring this person in. It was a sort of above that. You know, the misinformation in terms of the white van and the stuff that's being that always is put out there on television is a lesson learned, but it's now a reality. I mean, these cable networks, I mean, they have to fill 24-hour taped wheels of coverage, and so they'll take any crime and really blow them up and really sensationalize them. This was a sensational crime, as the word is used, but I think that was another lesson. Are there other lessons you? Yeah, and you know, and the other piece of it is that there was this influence from Muhammad over Malvo. I had really never seen anything like that. People say it, and you never believe it. This, I think, was one of those cases that actually was true. One of the rare cases. Yes, sir.
Is that like a tarot card recovered or something? With a statement on it?
Yeah, I want to talk about the tarot card.
Yeah, the tarot card was a death card. I don't know anything about tarot, so this was like my first exposure to it. But it was at the scene of the Iron Brown, that was the juvenile who was shot at the Tasker Middle School in Prince George's County. And it said, it was signed God, and it said, your children are not safe. It was designed, you know, to terrorize. There were hints on it, and it became sort of their signature. There were other crime scenes where they left similar writings. I think there was someone in the back who had their hand up first. We'll get to you next.
I just want to know, how did Malvo even wind up with Muhammad? I've never heard about that.
Well, they were in Antigua back when he was 14 or 15, and he would see, Malvo would see Muhammad with his children. Muhammad had taken his children and left the United States. He was a parental kidnapping. He didn't have legal custody of them, and he had taken them to Antigua. And Malvo would see them at a place where an arcade where they played video games, and he watched the interaction. And what he had described to us was he was so impressed with how good a father Muhammad was. Kind of an irony when you think about it, but what a good father he was, and what a good father figure. And he became friends with Muhammad and one of his sons. And at one point when Malvo was sick, his mother had left him. His father had left him years ago. His mother had left him behind, and he was living really in a shack by himself, and he had no food. And Muhammad came and took him in. So that, you know, it was, as I said, sort of the perfect storm. He filled a void in Malvo's life. Yes, you had a question.
Yes, I was curious. I live in Montgomery County, and I vividly remember that time period and how frightening it was, but also all of the media coverage. And I was wondering, what was it like from your vantage point to see the media coverage and where they may have been getting things right or wrong and all of the speculation? I'm just curious about that.
Well, I had a couple reactions to that. We had the task force was set up in a building right next to police headquarters, if you know where that is on Research Boulevard. There were vans out there 24 hours a day. There were daily or sometimes multiple daily press briefings by the chief of police. We tried to stay away from those, but we could see them we had lots of televisions inside the task force. And sometimes we would be seeing things on television that they were accurate, and we could not believe that the media had gotten that information. Frankly, and I used to be an assistant U.S. attorney, and I worked at the Department of Justice, we thought the leaks came out of DOJ, of Justice. Who knows? But it was shocking how much information they had about some of the inner workings of the investigation. On the other hand, all of that media attention, in some ways it helped solve the case. It certainly, the media televised the description of the car and the tag number when we finally had it one day before they were caught, and that was someone, the truck driver who saw them at the rest stop in Frederick County. That's how he got his information and called the police. So, there was good of it and bad of it.
How did you get that the information?
No, it didn't come from Malvo. As the Attorney General told you, there was a point in the investigation when Malvo was calling. They were making calls. I don't really understand. I still don't understand why they did this, but they didn't feel like people were paying enough attention to them, and they were making calls and no one would take the calls, so they wanted the callers to understand, the police to understand, we really are the snipers. So they told them to investigate this crime in Montgomery, Alabama. There were fingerprints recovered from that crime scene, and Malvo had been arrested after he came to the United States on an immigration. He was here illegally, so the Immigration Service had taken his fingerprints. The local police didn't have access to that. They matched the prints. They started putting two and two together, interviewed people in the state of Washington where the two of them had been. They got a name and identification of Muhammad, and Muhammad had actually legally purchased that car, and they found out, they got a description of the car and the tag number, and that's how the investigators came to have that information. Anybody else? Yeah.
Like, in being able to solve this, like, how does that make you feel as assist in, settling everybody's nerves? How does that, as those who really were the key components of everything?
Good and bad. Then what happens is you get the case and your prosecutor, you're dealing with the families, and it's horrible because there's no reason, there's no way to explain it. Our role and the law enforcement role, there's nothing we could do to bring them back to life. It's from a prosecutor standpoint, it's probably one of the greatest cases you could prosecute, because of the complexity of it and how it happened, the fact there's two of them and the mind relationship between the two of them. Those 22 days were rough. Everything was focused on Montgomery County and sort of the law enforcement in general. And, the press conferences were mentioned. They literally had 3 or 4 a day. I went to one as a personal favor to the chief. I stayed away from those because I wasn't sure that they were really that helpful. And it would look like some of the politicians were trying to make hay out of it and all that. We were just trying to do our job. Those 22 days were so exhausting, and and there were these highs and lows where you thought you had the person, and then you didn't. And but on the prosecution side, I think it went as well as it possibly could. There's always people get released on technicalities. There were some real issues in Virginia on the appellate side. In the murder that they actually convicted and executed Muhammad on, he was not the trigger man. And so the question was, could somebody who was not the triggerman be executed in a state that has a triggerman statute, which means you have to pull the trigger? They did. And then there's always questions, if you represent yourself, whether that was done. There's always sort of, was it ineffective assistance of counsel? It's kind of ironic that you could have that. But there's always ways you read about all the time on technicality. So we thought we needed to do it, and we did it from start to finish, and we were able to really have a good trial. So I think Kay's satisfaction has got to be pretty high. She did it with some other people in our office. I didn't want to prosecute it personally for a number of reasons. One, just the enormous amount of time. We have 1 million people in Montgomery County that would take, but also I didn't want to politicize the prosecution. So I went and watched them, and it was amazing to see. And we still see some of the families, we still see some of the people. And I feel like I've been in an elected office. I've been a prosecutor now for 18 years. People still come up all the time and say, "Oh, you guys were the sniper guys." People remember that because it was really a very turbulent time in our county where we live. All right. Well, thank you all for listening to us and for having us out here. It's great to be here. Thanks.